Good evening, everybody. I nearly said good morning. It is good morning somewhere in the world. Thank you so much for coming tonight, particularly on such a hot night. We really appreciate you coming and gathering here. We also welcome to those people online, and we hope that you're able to join in. Please share on the chat or the comms, and your questions or any comments you want to make, we can feed through to the rest of the community who's gathered here. While we're just beginning, I'll do a little bit of advertising. This morning we heard from Professor Auntie Anne about decolonising the biblical narrative, and Professor Emeritus Norm Harble was also here. So we had some great information and great insight from these two wonderful people. There are books out there by ATF Press for sale, and it's cheaper if you buy it here than if you have to go online and order it. And if you're here, it's actually the hardcover book. So it's a really good bargain. What's wonderful about this is it's volume 1. And there are more to come. Volume 2's already almost off the press, and then they were talking about going up to a whole lot of different other volumes over lunch. So watch this space. What's fantastic about the writings here is a gathering of insights through Auntie Anne and Norm, but it's also in conversation and alongside the wise people, the wisdom keepers really, in the Australian First Nations group. So it's not just a single person's focus, this is a gathered collective of really insightful ways of looking and hearing the word. So often we don't know that in the translation we are already being formed to think in a certain way. So listening to this and using it as a study is a great thing. It's broken into 12 chapters, and you could actually use it, I was suggesting, for a whole 10-week preaching plan. You've got the readings, you've got the insight, the reflections already started. But it also would be a wonderful way through this year, where we are coming towards a referendum, to actually rethink what's the language, what are the words, how have we been formed already, and how can we hear it in a different way as we listen to the voices of First Nations people. So it'd be a great Bible study group, book 2. There are also some other books called about the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and hopefully you have already received, as you're coming in, one of the cardboard Uluru Statements, held up the right way this time, and on the back you'll find that the statement has been printed in larger font, so it's for ease of reading as we go through tonight with Garry. He'll also, of course, have it on the screen. I'd like to welcome a wonderful friend, Uncle Alan, who will come and offer us a welcome.
Lovely. Thank you, Anne. Good evening. I see a few familiar faces from this morning, so welcome back to you. And I think you'll all agree that we had a wonderful session this morning, full of information, full of ideas, full of thoughts, and it was a lot to digest, but I think it was well laid out, well planned out, and we got a lot out of it. And Mark and I even got a personal best over lunch for the amount eaten. So we only just made it, I think. But so all in all, it's been a great day so far, and really looking forward to this evening. The land we are gathered on this evening is a traditional land of the Kaurna people, whose traditions, culture and beliefs are still practiced today, as they have been for thousands of years. I acknowledge those of you here from other areas, other countries, other cultures, and respect that you too have your own traditions, culture and beliefs. Also pay my respects to all of our elders, past, present and future, for without our elders we wouldn't have the stories, the knowledge and the wisdom we all possess today. as a local Kaurna Kukuta man, I'd like to welcome you all to Kaurna country and welcome you to this evening's forum on the Uluru Statement from the Heart. I think it's great that we can all come together and talk about this subject, particularly this year when we're staring down the barrel of a referendum and voice to Parliament. So it's great that we can come together, and I see it as an opportunity to educate people, and we're not only looking at educating black and white Australia, but as Dr. Ann mentioned this morning, we're such a multicultural society these days that those who are able to vote may not have any idea of the reason for this referendum, the reason for the Uluru Statement from the Heart. So it's a great opportunity for us to get the word out this year, to get the message out and to educate and inform. And we can do so through forums like this. So I hope you enjoy the evening. I hope you get a lot out of it. And thank you.
And I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Reverend Anne Hewitt, and I'm the Executive Director of Churches Together SA. We have organised this with Professor Auntie Anne and Garry, and we are very, very thankful for their presence with us tonight and for coming from interstate to be with us. Romans 12. Do not think of yourself more highly than you should. Instead, be modest in your thinking and judge yourself according to the amount of faith that God has given you. We have many parts in one body, and all these parts have different functions. In the same way, though we are many, we are one body. We have union with Christ and are all joined to each other as different parts of the one body. So we are to use our different gifts in accordance with the grace that God has given us. Our love must be completely sincere. Hate what is evil and hold on to what is good. Love one another warmly as Christians and be eager to show respect to one another. Today I share with you a wonderful painting which I am very proud owner of. Bernadine Johnson Camere was born in 1974 up at northeast of Alice Springs. She is an Arrernte woman. I love this painting. Bernadine, when she paints, uses no water. She allows the paint to flow from her brush and then adds a new colour directly to her brush, and so on. So if you look at the painting, each colour is joined to the other. Each colour has a part of the colour before, and the colour before that, and the one before that. When I look at that, it reminds me of the light that is refracted through a prism. We see unexpected rainbow hues, quite separate in colour, and yet they're held by the invisible light, and they disappear if the light is deflected away from the prism. To me, it also speaks of the light of Christ that's in each of us. Christ's light shows our own prismatic personalities that come from the same source, the source of love, and yet we are all so different. As we draw prayerfully together, we draw closer to God. As Christ's light shines through us, it brings out our individual gifts that we can offer to the whole. We are innately linked to each other through our spiritual expressions. Spiritual ecumenism speaks of our Christian journey, and I think this is a wonderful representation of it. As we pray and draw closer to God, we actually draw closer to each other. And as we draw closer to each other, we understand more about the gifts and the skills and the love that we have as friends in Jesus, or a community of love and kindness. Drawn together with the inextinguishable light of Christ offers us to see our diversity and uniqueness. This morning we heard of a wonderful sense of uniqueness that we have, of how we can actually work together as the whole Australian community towards reconciliation, towards deeper understanding, towards listening and learning from all people. And tonight we hear more and understand more deeply the Uluru Statement from the heart. Because so often we hear about the statement, but we don't realise how deeply it is brought to us from the heart of our First Nations people. So as we sit here together tonight, with all our multitude of colours, colourful personalities, of skills and gifts, may we really hone in on our own ability to listen, to understand, and to learn together. Let us pray. Loving One who sees us, knows us, and calls to us, open our eyes that we see each other. Clear our ears so we listen with intent. Set aside our preconceived ideas so that we face each other with openness and warmth. For as the whole people of God, we often lose our way. Loving One, we are joined together through your grace. Help us to use our diverse gifts to support and heal each other. Let this be a time where genuine love shines and grace is in the space between us. May we be blessed through the generosity of shared gifts and the wonder that hope inspires. We come before you as friends, as family, as the whole body of God, as one in you. Amen. It's my great pleasure to introduce you to Garry, who's got a wicked sense of humour and enjoys eating his meals, has a wonderful engagement across many different communities in Australia and beyond, and who has a fantastic way of being able to hear complex information and present it to us in a new way that is very accessible and well understood. He's a person of great learning and of great teaching. He's a person of great humour and great kindness. So tonight, I hope that you are open to his teaching and that we learn more about the statement from the heart. Tonight, we're hoping to be able to have input from Garry, and he's going to be giving you space to ask questions at certain spots. And then we'll have a time where we have a more open forum and have a bit of a break for a supper time. And then we'll come back for a panel with Auntie Anne, Uncle Garry and Uncle Alan sitting out the front. So you can actually bring before them questions in this safe space where it's okay to actually ask about any of the things that are relevant to the statement of the heart, to the Indigenous voice and what that means, and to your concerns or your absolute celebrations within your community. Please let us warmly welcome Garry.
Spirit is calling to you and work out what to do about that. We're not going to do that tonight, but I think it is an important exercise to, as a first move, listen and hear and inwardly digest, as we Anglicans say, the word that is before us and what it might say to us before a talking head gets up in front of you and tries to steal its thunder to some degree. Tonight I want to just take us through the Uluru Statement, and then I want to do a little bit of discussing about the way that this segues into the business of this year nationally, which is the referendum and the notion of the voice. And hopefully this pointer thing will move the slides along. So let's begin with what is the statement? What is the statement? Well, it's actually just a one-page, as you can see, a one-page summary of the conclusions of a First Nations National Constitutional Convention that happened on May 26, 2017, and it was held on Ananu country at Uluru. One little interesting thing about the Uluru bit in the statement. From the beginning, the Constitutional Convention wanted to come up with a statement, and it was always, they thought, going to be called the Uluru Statement. But you know what? Aboriginal people mess things up as well. And no one thought to ask the traditional owners of Uluru if that was okay. And so there was a bit of a flurry of withdrawing the name Uluru from the statement in the first 6 months or so, while those consultations took place, and then it reappeared. So for a while there, it wasn't the Uluru Statement from the heart, it was just the statement from the heart. The statement addresses not politicians, but the Australian people as a whole. It's actually a letter. It's in the genre of a letter that you would receive in the mail from a friend. And it is addressed not to the Prime Minister or the Governor-General or even the King, but the Australian people as a whole. It asserts the sovereignty of First Nations people over Australian lands and waterways. Sovereignty is a key word in this document, and we'll return to what that might mean a little bit later on. It seeks the amendment of the Constitution of Australia, which, let me remind you, is an entirely colonial document. There were no Aboriginal people had any input into that. So it seeks to amend this colonial Constitution of Australia to bring into being an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice to Parliament. So this is where the voice to Parliament comes in. It also proposes what it calls a Makarrata Commission. And we'll explore a little bit about what Makarrata means and its relationship and its non-relationship to another word, reconciliation, a bit later on. But a Makarrata Commission which would facilitate the negotiation of a treaty or treaties, more likely, between First Peoples and Australian governments at different levels. So it's getting ambitious now, isn't it? It's getting very ambitious. Finally, it proposes that truth-telling about the history of this country truth-telling be the foundation on which any such treaties are negotiated. And so, embedded in this one-page summary of the findings of a constitutional convention, you get this threefold call to the nation: voice, treaty, and truth. So there it is. Well, that's not it actually. This is a copy, just like the one in your hand. A lot of people look at this and they see the writing and they see the signatures around the statement of all the people who were at that constitutional convention. But a lot of people see the art around the outside as just a bit of decoration, just like the Aboriginal art that decorates government websites, you know, that kind of thing. But it's really important that you understand that that artwork, which was done by Auntie Renee Kalidja, and painters who are the traditional owners of the Uluru country, this is their way of saying that this statement came out of our country. And therefore, this is the story of the Uluru people, the dreaming of the Uluru people, in which the statement is, as it were, embedded. And what this means is that this statement comes from country, first of all, not from the brains of constitutional lawyers, not from the brains of even very smart Indigenous academics, but it comes from country. That is the voice that speaks in this statement, is the claim. Of course, there is a history. And it's important that we understand the history of where this statement came from if we're going to have any appreciation of what this statement is and what it isn't. Because what it isn't is also an important part of the story. So that constitutional convention that came up with the statement was actually the concluding part of a process of work done by what was known as the Referendum Council. So this was always about some kind of referendum to recognise Indigenous people in the Constitution. The Referendum Council was appointed in a bipartisan way, jointly by Malcolm Turnbull and Bill Shorten. You may remember that Bill Shorten was briefly the leader of the Australian Labor Party. And it was tasked with gauging First Peoples' views about constitutional reform and bringing proposals for a referendum to Parliament. Now, some of you may remember the Recognise campaign, which was a bit of a flop because it wasn't well thought through. But that happened in the early part of the, sort of 2011, 12, 13, 14, around that sort of period. But that was always also about trying to find a way in which this colonial constitution can in some way recognise the long history and spirituality and connection to this country of Aboriginal peoples. Now, this is really important for understanding what's going on. That Referendum Council operated, as all government committees do, according to a set of terms of reference. In other words, this is your job to do this, please don't do this, right? So they had to operate within these terms of reference, which in this case was about coming up with what it called realistic and doable proposals, within the current political climate. So there was an understanding, even in the terms of reference, that the political climate that we live in still is a fairly conservative one, and therefore don't come up with anything too radical. Because if you come up with anything too radical, especially if you want to take it to a referendum, you're just setting yourself up for failure. There was a bipartisan understanding about that, and so the terms of reference reflected that. So what the council did over a couple of years was it conducted 12 regional consultations across the whole of the country and brought these insights from those 12 regional consultations to the Constitutional Convention. And the Statement from the Heart summarises the final report of the Referendum Council, which was presented to Parliament in June 2017. So there was a fair bit of work going around the country in consulting. Those ideas, which were largely about what mob wanted in terms of our own future, those ideas were brought to the Constitutional Convention. They were talked about, honed, tweaked, until it came down to a final report. I'd really encourage you, if you haven't already, to go to the Referendum Council's website, which is still there, and read the final report, because it will help you understand what's going on in this one-page summary that we call the Uluru Statement from the Heart. So there they all are. There were a few key people who led the process, and they are still about now in new committees that are working on the design of the voice. Okay? So one of the key people was Professor Megan Davis. Megan is a cobble woman from southeast Queensland and an expert in constitutional law at the University of New South Wales and a consultant to the UN on Indigenous rights. Another key person in putting this all together was and remains Pat Anderson from the NT, and she has been working in Aboriginal health and wellbeing for a long time, many decades. And I would say that what she brings to the process is a long experience of dealing with Aboriginal illness, particularly mental illness. And so the question she asks always in these contexts, in these committees, is how will this help us to be well? That's a very different question than some of the constitutional questions, isn't it? How will this help us to heal and be well? This fella's probably a little bit better well known, Noel Pearson from Cape York. He's a lawyer and a founder of the Cape York Institute for Policy and Leadership. He's been part of the public conversation for a long time. In my opinion, he sits at the slightly more conservative end of Aboriginal politics. And I think that sort of realpolitik that Noel Pearson is really on about is reflected actually in the Statement from the Heart. It doesn't propose anything too radical. For those who are interested, those were the other members of the Referendum Council that did this work. You'll note that there's a number of key Aboriginal voices in there, but not all the people on the Referendum Council are Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. You'll note there the odd South Australian white person, you know, like Natasha Stott Despoja and so forth. So it was actually not only Aboriginal people that worked on this stuff. So let's turn to the text itself now, and I'm not going to do this exhaustively because that's like a whole semester course, and who has time for that, right? But what I want to do is just draw out a few things which I think are there but aren't necessarily seen to be there all the time when people read the statement. So this is what the first paragraph says. It says, "Our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander tribes were the first sovereign nations of the Australian continent and its adjacent islands, and possessed it under our own laws and customs. This our ancestors did according to the reckoning of our culture from the creation, according to the common law, that is British law, from time immemorial, and according to science, more than 60,000 years. Actually, about 110 if you believe what some archaeologists are publishing from dig sites in Warrnambool in Victoria. This time period that science talks about seems to get longer and longer all the time. So it's a very interesting opening paragraph. It makes no reference to the Constitution of Australia or to Australian law. It says we, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander tribes of this continent, possessed this continent under our own laws and customs and according to our own spirituality, our own sense of sovereignty since the creation. Now, the lawyers might say, well, since time immemorial, because that's a legal phrase. The scientists might say, 60,000 years, 70,000 years, 80,000 years, 110,000 years. But for us, our dreaming stories tell us, our ancestral stories tell us, that we have been here and we have had a relationship with this country since the creation, since the beginning, however you conceive that. So the point of view here is a point of view embedded in Indigenous ancestral storytelling. That's the perspective which is brought to the fore right from the beginning. There's nothing here about how to build fences and keep your neighbours out or anything like that. It's this sense that we are part of a community of being with country and have been since the beginning. It then goes on to talk about this notion of spiritual sovereignty. And I gather that this notion is proving to be a little bit elusive for many people. Let me read it. This sovereignty is a spiritual notion. The ancestral tie between the land or Mother Nature and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who were born therefrom remain attached thereto and must one day return thither to be united with our ancestors. This link is the basis of the ownership of the soil, or better, of sovereignty. It has never been ceded or extinguished and coexists with the sovereignty of the Crown. Now let's notice again the movement here. First thing you need to know is that whole bit that's in italics is not the words of the Constitutional Convention. Who knows where those words come from? It's actually a quote. It's Does anyone know? It's from the Mabo decision of 1992. Okay, the Mabo decision in the High Court. The history there, if you're unaware, is that Eddie Koiko Mabo and a number of other Torres Strait Islander people went to the High Court and asked for the High Court to recognise their sovereignty over their own country that they've lived on since creation. And they won, would you believe? And part of the Mabo decision, that is the document produced by the judges who made that decision in 1992, is this. And so this notion of spiritual sovereignty is actually embedded now in Western law in this country. Now, John Howard, of course, came along and with his 12-point plan and reduced the meaning of this down to this, and we got the abhorrent notion of native title. But in this decision, before that movement by the Howard government, is this recognition that there is a sovereignty which precedes the sovereignty of the Crown. It precedes and exceeds it. And it is there whether we like it or not. It is simply there. And the Crown might come along and claim sovereignty as it did, but that doesn't extinguish the sovereignty, the belonging, the connection, the relationship that Indigenous people have with this country, and the right to manage it according to our own laws and customs. That has always been there. A little aside. So, as I said, the italicised parts of the Mabo decision are there, and the Mabo, what you probably don't know is that the Mabo case drew upon case law from other parts of the world in order to come to that view. Very, very prominent in influencing the judge's position on this was a 1975 judgment in the International Court of Justice that was presided over by a Lebanese Maronite named Dr. Faoud Amoun. And in his judgment, he reflected upon the relationship that African people have with their land and their country. And he reflected upon their ancestral stories and their beliefs that the ancestors are still there, embedded in the landscape, and speak to the people and tell them who they are and what their responsibility is in caring for that country. He reflected on all of that, and in the West Sahara decision of 1975, he said, no Western colonial power can usurp that sovereignty, that relationship, that ancestral connection with country. And so this found its way into the Mabo decision because the judges talked to a lot of Aboriginal wisdom holders, knowledge holders, and recognised that that's exactly what's going on here as well. That kind of ancestral connection. That's the end of the aside. So what does this spirituality look like and feel like? Well, instead of talking endlessly about this in sort of propositional terms, I thought it might be a good idea at this point to just share with you a little kind of poem, if you like, that I wrote a couple of years ago that I think helps non-Aboriginal people start to get inside what it feels like, this kind of notion of spiritual sovereignty and connection to country. And it goes like this. We are all born from the watery womb of country. Country feeds us with the pure nectar of her own life. From the beginning of creation and in every moment, country dies. By her death, everything that is dead is made alive. Country teaches us who we are and how we are to live. Country is our mother, our father, our uncle and auntie, our sister and our brother. Country is our kin. And in her familial body we find that all creation, plants, animals, and even the starry host above are kin to us as well. Country teaches us to care for our kin as country cares for us. Country bids us to imitate what we see in country, to watch, to listen, to imbibe, and to notice. To take what we learn into ourselves and write it on our hearts. And when we die, country takes us into the heart of her own death, so that we may be born to an intimacy that is even more wonderful than anything we could think or imagine. So this is what we mean by sovereignty. We mean a relationship, a kinship system, a mutual responsibility in which we know who we are and what we are to do in the world. Let's return to the Uluru Statement. How could it be otherwise? It goes on. That peoples possessed a land for 60 millennia and this sacred link disappears from the world merely in the last 200 years? Because this is really what the colonists who came here claimed. Even those who were interested enough to learn a little bit about our ancestral stories nevertheless claimed that all that stuff has to be put aside to make room for the civilising influence of the colonists. With substantive constitutional change and structural reform, it says, we believe this ancient sovereignty can shine through as a fuller expression of Australia's nationhood. Now, I want you to hear in here the generosity of this statement, the generosity of this statement. They could have said, let's list all the genocidal sins. We'll list them here for you in case you didn't know about them. We'll list them all. We'll talk about the massacres, the stealing of lands. We'll talk about the poisoning of the environment. We'll talk about the stealing of children, the destroying of culture. You know, I wish you would all just go home. You know, that's what they could have said. And they would have had every right to say that, actually. But they didn't. They said, we're happy to continue to work with you, to mess around, as it were, with the colonial structures you've brought, so that at least some of what we have always had and always exercised and the responsibility to care for country can shine through and inform the traditions and the way of managing things that you have brought here. That's essentially what this paragraph says. It's incredibly generous. It's more generous than I am. It does go on to mention a couple of sins. Proportionally, we are the most incarcerated people on the planet. That's just a fact. Lots of people talk about the African American population of the prison systems in the United States being incredibly high. Our imprisonment rates here for Indigenous peoples are double that. But the protest here is we're not an innately criminal people. Our children are alienated from their families at unprecedented rates. This cannot be because we have no love for them. And our youth languish in detention in obscene numbers. That is also true. In Melbourne, which a lot of people think is not a terribly Aboriginal place, in the juvenile justice system in Melbourne, 62% of the kids in the juvenile justice system today are Aboriginal. 62%. These kids are our hope for the future. The Uluru Statement mentions our children 4 times. The implication is we want to effect these changes in the nation for the sake of our kids. We want them to grow up in an Australia which is shared and yet is a place where they can be proud to be who they are, where they can be proud to bring to the conversation our ancestral stories and our ancestral history. They can be proud to bring our sovereign knowledges and wisdom to the conversation, rather than being constantly told that they're a waste of space, a waste of fresh air, and a waste of words and money, as we were told when we were growing up. This is the torment of our powerlessness. We have a power which comes from the ground beneath our feet, yet we are not allowed to exercise it because it is not recognised as a power for good for all of us. This is a problem. Sovereign and yet powerless to be able to contribute to the national conversation. And so, we're at the sort of therefore stage of the statement. And so, we seek constitutional reforms. Why? To empower our people and take our rightful place in this country. When we have power over our destiny, our children will flourish. When we can teach our kids the way we want to teach them. When we can take them onto our country rather than being confronted with fences. When we can take our children to our country and tell them the ancestral stories and tell them their part in keeping that country whole and healing it, and therefore healing ourselves. When we can do that, our children will flourish. They will walk in 2 worlds, as the Uluru Statement says, and their culture will be a gift to the country. The movement from, at best, an inconvenience for the country, through to it being a gift. That is why we seek constitutional reform. And so we get to the bits at the end where we hear about the voice, the treaty, and the truth. We call for the establishment of a First Nations voice enshrined in the Constitution. Why enshrined in the Constitution? Because the Constitution is sort of like the foundational document of the reality that we live in, and if we're not in that, then we're not in the country. We might be sovereign owners of the country, but we're not in the document that says what the country is and how it operates. So we need to be in the Constitution. If we're not there, then we can be ignored over and over and over again. That is the argument of the Referendum Council. Makarrata is the culmination of our agenda, the coming together after a struggle. Makarrata, as some of you know, is a Yolngu word from up north. And it actually encodes a whole series of practices which are about how you deal with wrongdoing, the breaking of the law in community, and it might be sort of brought together under the idea of restorative justice, as Auntie Anne was talking to us about this morning. Restorative justice. So it's not actually, some people say Makarrata equals reconciliation. It doesn't. It's because reconciliation is often understood as someone says sorry and someone forgives them. No. In this understanding, justice has to be done before forgiveness can happen. So there has to be fundamental change in the person who has done wrong, the community that has done wrong, the mob that has done the damage, to seek to undo that damage as best as possible. And when all that can be done, has been done for justice, then you can talk about forgiveness, but not before. So this is all embedded in this word Makarrata. So a Makarrata commission would actually oversee treaty talks, which would be about justice. What needs to be done to bring about the most justice that we can so that this country can be healed? We won't get justice itself in a pure form because none of you are going home to the Northern Hemisphere as far as I can see. So that kind of purist understanding of justice isn't possible. But what we can do is something like justice in talking together and working through the damage that has been done. That's why there's that reference to coming together after a struggle. We have to struggle together, just like Jacob struggled with the angel in the creek, in the stories in Genesis. And then we can talk about forgiveness. Again, this paragraph says this is all so that we can have a fair and truthful relationship with the people of Australia and a better future for our children based on justice and self-determination. Because the colonial mind is always saying, we know what is best for you. And we say back, no, you don't. We know what is best for us. Allow us to do that, and our children will have a better future. And finally, a Makarrata commission to supervise a process of agreement making, that is treaties between government and First Nations, and truth-telling about our country. So embedded in this language is two ideas. The idea of setting up the rules by which treaties might be initiated and carried out, and also this idea of what some people call a truth commission, which in every part of the country recognises the damage that has been done through colonisation and seeks in some way to address that and undo that and have processes for healing in those specific places. Now, if you think this all sounds like pie-in-the-sky stuff, I want you to think about what's happening in the state of Victoria. For 5 years now, Victoria has been on a journey in which we have a voice, we have a truth-telling commission called the Uluru Justice Commission, and we're about to start treaty negotiations this year. In other words, we're now at the point where the rules are in place, the rules of engagement. We've got an independent umpire. All that is now in place, and we're ready to start treaty talks. We're going to elect a new First Peoples Assembly, which is our version of the voice. We elected one 5 years ago. I voted in those elections, but, you know, the term is finished, so we're going to elect a new, and they are going to be one of the key parties in the treaty negotiations. So it can be done. It can be done, and it should be done. Now, before I go on and talk a little bit about what happened after the Uluru Statement was promulgated and where we're up to now, which is all going to be a lot quicker, believe me, I thought I might just give you an opportunity perhaps to just turn to a neighbour or a couple of neighbours and just for a few minutes have a bit of a natter about what you have heard as kind of as you know, brought up in you. Is there something that you are bewildered by, or you're excited by, or you want to ask a question about? Just have a little natter with each other for a few minutes about that, and then we can have a bit of to and fro. All right, let's come back. There's time just for a few comments and questions. You don't have to ask a question, but if you want to make a comment, feel free. I don't propose to engage with everything in a lot of detail because, you know, time is short. But if anyone has a comment or indeed a question, please feel free. There's some folk at the back with microphones and things, so you can make your way to one of those microphones and ask your question. We're doing it this way because we're recording this so that it can be used by other folk or small groups or whatever at another time. Yep. They're going to turn you up, sorry. Yeah. Go for it, go for it.
Yes,
yep.
yes.
Yeah. My question is, how will we know who the voice is? Because it seems to me that there's many people who are claiming to be part of the first Australians at this time. And some of them are quite substantially removed from those people. And the question that I think a lot of people are asking is, who are we giving these rights to?
Yeah. Well, the first thing to say, and I'm preempting some of what will happen next, but is to say that this proposal is actually super conservative in the sense that the voice will have no power at all. It will have no legislative power. It won't have a budget to do any social service provision, for example, or anything like that. It's just going to be an advisory group. Now, some will say, well, we've had advisory groups in the past. You know, in 1828, you know, Governor Collins on my country, Tralloway country in Worete, Tasmania, set up an Aboriginal council to advise him. And one of my ancestors, Manalagena, was on that council, but he didn't listen to that voice. In 1972, Gough Whitlam set up an Aboriginal Advisory Council, the first one in modern times, if you like, modern being the 20th century apparently. But you know, he didn't listen to that voice. When the Whitlam government went out, the Fraser government came in and they set up an Advisory Council of Aboriginal people. Didn't listen to that. Under the Hawke-Keating regime, they set up ATSIC. Now, ATSIC was different because it wasn't just a group of people appointed, people were elected to ATSIC. That was a very big difference. And I remember my dad coming back from voting, you know, in the ATSIC elections in 1992. And we thought this was a great step forward. We can elect people so that it's not just people that the government handpicks. We can elect people out of our communities. Terrific, you know. But the problem was that when the government changed, they just unlegislated ATSIC, you know. So that's why, so this proposal for a voice is really saying we want an advisory group to advise the government on all manner of things, including setting up treaties, and particularly setting up treaty processes. But we want the reality of this body to be in the Constitution so that if the government changes, it can't just get rid of the body. You know, if something is embedded in the Constitution, you can't get rid of it. It's there. And so that means that even if the government decides that everything that the voice is saying is a waste of space and they won't do anything about it, they can't get rid of it. It will always be there, talking to government, making representations to government. So it's kind of like ATSIC slightly improved, is what I'd say. So I say to people, what we're doing now is we're going back to 1992. We're going back to Mabo. We're going back to ATSIC, but we're trying to improve. We've been in the wilderness since then, but we're getting back there now to talk about it. And I'll talk a little bit about the makeup of the voice in a moment. Yes, please. Go to the microphone so we'll be able to hear your question or your comment.
There's something I would like you to comment on. My background is I'm a lawyer, and something I'm struggling with, and I'd invite your comment, is that the almost, I don't want to be too polemical, but almost two worlds. We've got the traditional Aboriginal cultural system, and then we have what I think you described as colonial law, which I'd perhaps see Australian law based on the British system. I guess where I'm sort of wondering at the moment is if we're talking about a treaty and if we're talking about two sort of separate, almost legal systems trying to talk to each other, could I just ask you to comment a bit on what that might look like?
Well, what it would look like is like any other treaty that's been negotiated at any other time in the history of the world. In other words, you'll have two sovereign entities who agree on some rules, and then they'll talk together and they'll come up with some new rules that will apply to everyone. And that's what all treaties do. And so this will be no different to that. So it's been done a few thousand times before, we just have never done it in this country. Yeah.
I was also wanting to talk about the treaty aspect because one of the Greens people have actually resigned from the Greens because she wants a treaty, and her understanding as an Indigenous person is that that is not what the voice is about, but you are presenting it as treaty making. So I was just a little bit confused about that and wondered if you could talk a little bit about that.
I can. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to skip over a whole bunch of things. The Turnbull government obviously rejected the proposal for the voice outright. The Morrison government said, yes, let's have a voice, we'll design one, but we won't enshrine it in the Constitution. But it set up a voice design committee chaired by Marshall Langton and Tom Calmer, and they designed a voice. What it would look like, how it would be elected, all that sort of stuff. They designed it. They presented the report about that to the Morrison government, but now the Liberals are disowning that, right? The Labor government has said we'll actually implement most of the stuff that's in that report. So let me just go to the Lydia Thorpe thing, because this comes up all the time. In that question is the proposed voice a priority for Aboriginal and Islander people? In other words, for all Aboriginal and Islander people? I would say yes, but in different ways, or yes with qualifications. I think this is demonstrable. So obviously, as I've been saying, the authors of the Uluru Statement and the community consultations that fed into that around the country argued that the voice needs to come first so that it can propose arrangements for treaty making, for a Makarrata Commission which would overlook treaty making. That is what it's primarily for. It will make representations to government about a whole range of social and economic issues as well, obviously, you know. But it's one of its primary tasks, according to the Referendum Council report and the Uluru Statement, is to speak to government about setting up this Makarrata Commission which would oversee treaty talks. All right? That's a big part of it. So anyone who says it's not about treaty hasn't actually read it, right? Hasn't actually read the report. Others, Indigenous academics, I would probably include myself in this group, and Green politicians, obviously, depending on which one you talk to, argue that all three aspects of the statement need to be progressed together. That is, voice, treaty and truth need to be progressed together. There's no reason why one has to come before the other, and you're putting together a voice, but that doesn't mean you can't be setting up a truth commission at the same time, and you can't be talking about treaty frameworks already. That's actually what's happened in Victoria over the last 5 years. We've got a voice, we've got a Uruk Justice Commission, and we're about to start treaty talks because all the rules have been worked out. You know, we already have the rules of how we would engage in treaty negotiations in place. They're there in documentation. So you know, some of us are saying, in a sense, it doesn't matter which comes first. The Uluru Statement says voice first because then it can make representations about how to do the other stuff. Fine, that's logical. But real life suggests that you don't have to just do one and then the other and then the other. You can actually work on all three at the same time. And I think that's fair enough. Lydia Thorpe. So what you need to understand about Lydia Thorpe is she comes out of a long-standing activist group based in Yorta Yorta, Wurundjeri and Wiradjuri communities that have been on the very, very radical end of Aboriginal politics for a long, long time. This is the group, you know, Garry Foley and so on, who set up the embassy, the 10 Embassy in Canberra, which is the longest political protest in the world, you know. It's been continually going on since 1971. So she comes out of that sort of long experience of activism and protest, and she's right about a lot of things, I think. She's right that if it's just about an advisory group that talks to government but has no power, then that's no good, because we've had those before and it doesn't make a scrap of difference, right? She's right when she says that it's about sovereignty. It is about sovereignty. It's about whether this country can recognise our ongoing sovereignty, which has never been ceded. She's right when she says it's about a rights framework which brings us into a better relationship with the state so that there is more justice. She is right in saying that the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People from the UN is a key instrument to help get that happening in Australia. She is right about all these things, right? The voice of that more radical end of the Aboriginal community is an Aboriginal voice that needs to be taken seriously. The difference, I would suggest to you, between the Lydia Thorpes of the world and the Professor Megan, end of the world, is that Lydia and everyone from her communities are very impatient to get right over here as quickly as possible, all right? Whereas the Professor Megans and the Noel Pearsons of the world recognise that the Australian community is very, very conservative, and we have to do it incrementally. We all want to get to the same place. We want to have a treaty which enshrines a more just settlement for Indigenous people. That's what we all want, because we know that that's the only thing that will create a future for our kids. But we just, some have this activist background that's more impatient, and some are more the carefully, because, unless we do it carefully, the whole thing could be shot down overnight, So it's really a question of method rather than what we want is the difference. And I actually think that if in a modern democracy, if it's a healthy democracy, there's room for all of these voices to make a contribution, and let us hear those voices. That's all I'm going to say on Lydia Thorpe. Was there any other comment just before I quickly go into the referendum stuff? Okay. Right. So you are aware, are you not now, that there is going to be a referendum. The referendum was originally proposed to be sort of early next year, but it's looking at the moment like it might actually be late this year, even August or September. Now, I don't want to comment on the wisdom of that. I don't want to comment on the wisdom of that. But this will be the referendum question. We know this because Albanese announced it at the Garma Festival pretty soon after he was elected. Do you support an alteration to the Constitution that establishes an Aboriginal and Islander voice? It's a very simple question. Everyone who's researched referendum questions tells you it has to be really simple. It doesn't have to... Please don't spell out all the details of what that will look like, because people will just turn off. It has to be a really simple yes or no question. And what this question, what this proposed question seems to suggest is that basically it's asking the people of Australia, do you think it's a good idea for Aboriginal people's voices to be heard in the Parliament? Now, if you think that's a good idea, then vote yes. If you think Aboriginal people have no place in modern Australia and should not have a voice, then vote no. It's as simple as that. In addition, at that same Garma Festival speech, Albanese announced three proposed sentences that would go into the Constitution, right? So this this would be as a consequence of voting yes. If you vote, what they've said is, if you vote yes in the referendum, these are the 3 sentences that we will add to the Constitution. There shall be a body to be called the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice makes representations to Parliament and the executive government on matters related to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. The Parliament shall, subject to this Constitution, have power to make laws with respect to the composition, functions, powers and procedures of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice. So, in short, you couldn't get a more conservative proposal if you tried. There shall be a body called the Voice. It will make representations to Parliament and to the executive government. The Parliament will decide how that voice will do its stuff. I mean, it came out of, it came out of a conservative process. So it's a conservative proposal. It's not in the least radical. You'll be aware that if you're going to have a successful referendum under the laws of this country, and when I say the laws of this country, I mean the colonial laws of this country, right? Then you need to have the support of a majority of voters in a majority of states, in other words, 4 of the 6 states. But you also have to have a majority of voters overall nationally. So you have to have 51% of all people who are entitled to vote in this country saying yes, and you have to have 51% of 4 of the 6 states saying yes in order for it to get up. So that's where we've got to go. Now, designing the voice. This is important because this is where a lot of the argy-bargy is at the moment in the political process. The Indigenous Voice Co-Design Process final report, in other words known as the Langton-Kama report, was provided to the Morrison government in July 2021. It's a public document. You can find it there, right there. There's the website. Okay? The Albanese government has said that it will most likely follow most of the recommendations in this report. So if you want to know how you get onto the voice body and how the voice body operates and what the voice will do, there it is. As the former Aboriginal Affairs Minister said to his own colleagues when they said there's no detail, read the damn report, you know. What does the report say in summary? The report says that it will provide for the election or appointment of people to a national voice out of local voice bodies. Now, local voice bodies can be traditional owner groups, Aboriginal controlled organisations, land councils, you know, any registered Aboriginal party can put candidates forward for the voice. The voice design is being finalised by a First Nations referendum working group chaired by Minister Linda Burnley and Special Envoy Senator Pat Dodson. That's happening now. In the report, there's this neat little diagram, which I'm going to skip over because it's actually not very helpful. This is more helpful. So the voice body is not proposed to be a massive parliament-sized body, right? It's not going to be like that. It's going to be a group of around 24 members. Now, they may kick it up to 30 for various reasons, but the proposal is for 24 members of the voice. Now, each state will be able to put forward a lot of candidates. There'll be elections, but 2 people from each state will be elected to the voice, each state and territory, I should say, So even the ACT, you'll notice there, gets 2 people. They're the people in the blue circles, right? So that's the baseline representation, 2 people from each state elected by Aboriginal people to the voice. But in recognition of the knowledge-holding capacity of some of the more remote and traditional communities, there will be a few extra people added as well. So there'll be an extra person for the Northern Territory, an extra person for sort of effectively the Kimberley. There'll be an extra person for South Australia, representing the traditional communities in the north of the state in particular. There'll be an extra person for New South Wales, because apparently they have traditional Aboriginal people as well. There'll be an extra person for Queensland, and there'll be an extra person for the Torres Straits as well. Now notice they've already got 2 people elected from the Torres Straits, but they'll have a 3rd person as well under this proposal. So all of that adds up to 24 members of the Voice elected by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So when you have the referendum question, you're being asked, is it okay if we have a body like that to advise government on Aboriginal policy moving forward? That's effectively what you're being asked. Now, obviously, the Uluru Statement itself and the Referendum Council report foreshadow moving towards treaty, which is where we all want to get to, a more just settlement. But for the moment, all that's being asked in the referendum question is, are you okay with an advisory body that they're calling the Voice, which will have roughly 24 members, maybe 30, but somewhere between 24 and 30 members, elected by Indigenous people to speak into Aboriginal policy in the Parliament and the Executive Government. That's what you're being asked. Nothing more, nothing less. That's all. So it's not actually as complicated as a lot of people think it is. It's actually very, very straightforward, and I encourage you to vote yes. Here endeth the lesson. Now, I think we're going to have a break and you can grab some supper. Is that what it's called? Supper? Levinses? No, that's Hobbit talk, isn't it? Yeah. And then we're going to come back and have a little panel where you can ask other things, you know. So, thank you.
So we're going to do the road and we'll be swapping that over. Hello. Can you hear my dulcet tones, Anne? How are you, Anne? Hi, Margaret. Thanks for waving at me. Hi. Oh, I am here. Hello, everybody. I'm very conscious that it's 10 to 9, so it's going to be a very quick panel, isn't it? Oi, you out in the foyer.
That sounds so much like the boy. Look at it.
Boys, you might get in here.
That's right. Oh dear. Here comes Alan. That's good. Yes, we can. Yep.
Did you get a decent cuppa?
Thank you, everybody, for regathering back into our space. I know there have been some very interesting conversations happening out there, and I'm sure there are probably some questions or, oh, they didn't say about. So this is our time. Although it is 10 to 9, if we're all on a roll and going, we can extend it a bit longer. I do apologise to those who are online if you need to leave and you miss the rest of the conversation. I'm just reinforcing again that we will be having both the morning session and the afternoon session edited and uploaded to the Churches Together SA YouTube channel. It will be in about a week or two's time. No pressure or anything, tech guys, because I know people are asking already. We'll also share it with the University of Divinity and with the National Council of Churches, so that there should be 3 different areas that you can access that information. I'd like to hand over to our wonderful panel now. Alan Edwards is on the panel as well. He has been a chair of a local reconciliation group up at Blackwood, which is an extremely active and very productive reconciliation group. So our time with the panel here is to help you have some clarifying questions, any comments, something that's puzzling. This is the time when you have 3 very wise people to answer the things for you. Please remember to use the microphone. Yes, what shall I buy for my Christmas present? No, it's please remember to use the microphone in the centre of the room so that everyone can hear your question, including the people out the front. So who would like to come up first? Thank you, Margaret.
I wonder whether you could just give us an example of what a treaty sentence would be.
A treaty sentence, did you say?
Yeah, or the kind of language of a treaty. What, for example, is in the Victorian proposals, for example? I'm just not aware of how a treaty sentence looks. I know
well,
more than one.
There haven't been treaty talks yet, but there are rules about how the treaty should be negotiated, and there's a whole heap of stuff in there about if you hit a wall and you're not getting anywhere, what do you do? So there's some processes outlined for that. But basically, what's important about treaty is not necessarily the language that's used, but the relationship and the setting of a new relationship. The kinds of things that I think most mob are interested in treaty talks pursuing are, access to land, which is a lot better than native title gives us, being able to go on country and to look after it properly, go on country and live from its fruits, go on country and farm it, in our traditional ways, and so on, rather than just access, which is what most native title legislation gives you, but you have actually no economic or political power in relationship to that country. So there's a kind of a land back. Land is a very big part of all treaty stuff, I think, you'll find as we move forward. The other thing is, because a lot of damage has been done that can't be undone, we'll be looking for reparations. Reparation funds, so that we can have an economic base to set up our, our work with our kids, our employment services, our industry and business, and that sort of stuff, health, on a basis according to our methodologies and our knowledges, So that reparations process means that we have the economic base to do that self-determination sovereignty thing. So you'll find that those two things will be front and centre of all treaty negotiations. And ultimately, I think a lot of us would like a new constitution in this country, because the current one is overwhelmingly, an overlay of our sovereign relationship to country with that of a foreign power. We would like a new treaty, a new constitution, which recognises continuing sovereignty and the continuing right of Indigenous people to care for our own country, that kind of thing. So there's a little sample. Anyone else want to have a go? Okay.
Answered nicely.
Thank you. Yeah, go for it.
Yep.
This might be naive of me, but I was wondering whether you could talk a little bit about what the term self-determination means. I've heard a lot of the term, but I don't know what it means to you.
Do you want to go?
Look, self-determination for Aboriginal people is having the right to determine our future, our prosperity, and the delivery and recognition of our culture, to be able to practice our cultural heritage, to have that right to engage with country in a way that sustains us, firms us, and fulfills our spirituality and our spiritual relationship with the Creator and our ancestors. So that's what self-determination means. It means a lot of things, but it means that we get to do it in our own right.
If I can just add to that, and for me as well, this is what the voice is all about for me. For too long, we've been told what we need. You know, this is what you're going to get because you need this. This is what you need to do because you need to do this. And that self-determination is about us making those decisions, us making those choices. You know, we've marched down King William Street. I can remember since the 70s, you know, during NAIDOC Week marches, different rallies, different protests, and fighting for that. Fighting, you know, we need to have our say. We need to tell you what we need. We don't need you to tell us what we need. And that's what the voice is all about, I think, is part of that self-determination. We've got the self-determination, but we just haven't been able to show it.
Thank you. Thank you for that excellent presentation. I really enjoyed that. I'm one of those people, I can physically remember where I stood when I heard that Malcolm Turnbull rejected the Uluru Statement. But I can also remember where I stood the moment when I heard Paul Keating recite his Redfern speech. And I'm thinking, if any politician or leader from the country cites that today as a fresh awareness, do we even need to have a vote? Wouldn't it just be yes, please? So I'm just wondering, why don't we have more reference to what Paul Keating said and what the values were that we need to now decide upon?
It was a privilege to be at the Redfern gathering when Paul Keating spoke. It came as a surprise to most of us First Nations people because we didn't expect it. We were just invited and he was going to speak to us. So to have those words so powerful and so defining to be stated by the PM at that time was just absolutely empowering to us. All that we believed and held, the hurt and the pain that in the denial of our history, he affirmed and owned and claimed on behalf of this country the destruction and the genocide that took place. And it was powerful. I make a reference to it constantly. I don't think there'd be a lot of white folk out there that want to make a reference to it because it is so condemning. But it is a powerful statement, and it's one that we should be reminded of. One of the things that I said this morning, you know, I talked about Australia's Damascus moment, and we are at that point of our Damascus moment where we have an opportunity to repent but also be transformed and to be able to stand up on the righteousness of Christ and the justice of God to call out the sins of this country. That's what we're called to do. And we need to be doing it more. We need to be doing it more. We shouldn't be waiting for politicians to name our sin. We should be naming our sins. That's what we're called to do as Christians. It's a shame that we're not doing it. We're not doing it enough, and we're not doing it loud enough. We expect our heads of churches to do our statements. That's not good enough. You got a voice. God talks to you, not just to the head. Talks to you. It's your conviction. It's how do you want to respond, because the moment begins within us. Our Damascus begins here, in us. And if that transformation can begin, then it becomes a national movement.
Thank you.
I mean, Paul Keating's Redfern speech is a marker of recognition, the kind of recognition we're looking for on a whole range of other levels, of course. And so we in the Indigenous community remember these things, and we celebrate them, and we celebrate the anniversary of these things, you know. We have celebrations, we re-watch the speech, we re-listen to it, and so forth. But as far as we can see, that Indigenous remembering has not yet been taken up by the whole country. And partly what we're looking for is a co-ownership of these very, very important revelatory moments which show us who we really are.
Yeah, I'd just like to reassure everyone that my classes have been doing comprehensions on the Redfern speech every year for a very long time.
Thank you.
Yes, and we also watched Kevin Rudd and his speech and go through that and everything. Anyway, what I wanted to say was you gave a lovely kind of relational definition of sovereignty. And then I looked up in my dictionary, and in the dictionary it says, the authority of a state to govern itself or another state, self-governing state, supreme power or authority. So I was just going to make the point that perhaps sometimes our language is, you know, we're using the same word, but it means something different, and we need to convey that other meaning more frequently.
Part of why Indigenous people, talk about sovereignty is because, it's a word that's part of Western thinking. And so we're trying to take a word which is part of your systems, your common law, your Westminster system, and expand it and tweak it so that it means something that we can deal with, So it's partly a question of communication. We do a lot of work in learning to learn your language, speak your language. It'd be good if some of it went back the other way occasionally. But also, we obviously take these essentially colonial concepts and we want to expand them and fill them with our own content at the same time. Yeah.
And I think that's why this... And I think that's why this year is going to be a big learning year for everyone. I mentioned this morning to those who were here this morning the package that we put together at Pilgrim to present to people of other faiths, other cultures, other groups about the referendum and the voice to Parliament, and we've brought it down to a 3-page summary of what it's all about, and we've also got an attachment to it of what the words in that mean. So you know, as I mentioned earlier, it's going to be a big year for educating people this year, for bringing those words out and making sure everyone understands exactly, you know, not to say what you need to vote yes or no at the end of it all. You know, we hope that people can learn enough and be educated enough to make that decision on their own. Hopefully they'll make the right decision, but it's the right decision for them, whatever it's going to be anyways.
Speaking of words and definitions and things, in my head, the word treaty seems a very colonial term. And for me, I think in my limited understanding that I associate it with a treaty in New Zealand, and also a word that used to get used a lot in a North American context. Is there a better word? Is there like a covenant or an agreement or another word where there's not the power differential used? I'm just curious about, I mean, you've probably half answered it because saying about giving more definition, more meaning to words, but I'm just wondering if that's really the best word for what we want.
What Garry explained, the makarata, that's the word we use, because that's restorative justice, that's restoring. For us, when we administer and practice makarata, it's about restoring relationships. That's first and foremost in the relation. That's the whole process, is about restoring relationships. And that's what Aboriginal people are asking for. They're wanting to restore the relationship, or have a relationship that's based on restorative justice, that recognises what's been taken from us and what needs to be given back in order to be reconciled. And you know, God talks about it, and Christ talks about it, and calls us repeatedly to a process of restorative justice in biblical text. And yet we have failed. And I don't know why we've failed, but we have failed as a Christian community to act justly and to do justice. And what I'm hoping is that, you know, as I said, this can be done. We need to stand. We need to raise our voice as the Christian conscience of this country. And we need to redeem ourselves within this context, in this journey. As I always said, my redemption is tied to your redemption, and I can't be redeemed unless you're redeemed. So it's got to be done together, and God is calling us to do it together. So when we talk about treaty, when we talk about everything else, it's all relationship.
I was just thinking, reflecting, I think when restoration really can happen, then we can move properly towards reconciliation, I would imagine. But I may be wrong.
Yeah, I mean, there are different words that can be used in different contexts. Certainly from the point of view of Aboriginal management of relationships, makarata is a key concept. But a good biblical concept, which those of you, are there any Christians in the room? A good biblical concept to think about is the notion of covenant. In a previous life, I wrote my doctorate on this notion of covenant and the way that covenant is enacted in Christian ritual. And I think that we could do a lot with that. Aboriginal councils of various churches have been calling for a covenant. That's a word for treaty or makarata that, you know, that kind of has a dynamic equivalence. That's the kind of thing that we've been calling for many, many years, some kind of covenant.
I didn't want to use that word because Reverend Charles Harris came with that in the 1988, invited the church, the Uniting Church, to begin a covenant with its Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Here we are, how many decades later, and we still don't have a covenant. So I don't like to use the term because we made a mockery out of it. God's church has made a mockery of what that significance of that word means and what it means relationship-wise. So, yeah, I'll rather use our own language, Makarrata.
Just a comment about your, and the phrase is gone now, your control over your
Self-determination.
Self-determination, thank you. I'm just thinking about, you're probably aware the Bungala are taking the government to court, the federal government to court, because they weren't even allowed to have a vote whether we have a nuclear dump on their land. So, you know, if we had self-determination, they would be able to veto that dump. But yeah, that's just an aside. Treaty, covenant, whatever. How, once we, and I'm hoping, praying that we will get the yes vote, how do you see that proceeding? Would it, like in South Australia, the Ngarrindjeri have had discussions in the past, talked with South Australian government for about 3 years on treaty. Narungga have also been working with the government on treaty. Do you see it to be a nationwide treaty? Would it be with different nations? Would it be, and Victoria obviously statewide? How do you, what's your vision?
It'd probably, look, the treaty consultation is happening state by state, territory by territory, and it's likely to be that that's going to be where the agreements are negotiated and implemented and signed. The federal one, because under the Commonwealth law, the federal government has the power to make decisions over our lives and can legislate over our lives at a Commonwealth level, they need to also be doing the same process. So you'll probably look at having maybe, you know, multiple ones, treaties, but at the same time, they'll also probably complement each other rather than override each other. So there will be a lot of consultation around what that may look like as time goes on. But here, I'll give it to Brother Boy. He might, because this is his country, and let him talk on it.
No, I was just going to say in general, I think, you know, all levels of government need to get involved in this process of what we're doing this year. And I think all levels of government are trying to show that they want to get involved and want to be seen doing something. Our own Premier last week announced that we're going to have a voice to Parliament in South Australia, you know, separate from the national one. And as Garry said, you know, Victoria have had their first People's Assembly for the last 5 years. So this is something that is nationwide, but we also at the same time need to get all levels of government involved, local, state, federal, and I think as time goes on, they want to be seen to be involved, to be doing something. They don't just want to be part of the national scheme of things. As I mentioned, our Premier with our state. So, you know, it's good to be seeing that from all different levels of government, and that's what's needed. You know, we've known this for a long time. You know, blackfellas are very patient. As Auntie Anne said before, you know, with the covenant, you know, the Aboriginal flag was first flown right here in Adelaide, 1971. Took 25 years for it to be recognised as a national flag of Australia in 1996. So, you know, we've waited a long time for things like this to happen. And that's why I'm really focused on this year and the end of this year. The last time, you know, that we had something I think this significant was when Kevin Rudd gave the apology. And you know, everyone is affected in a different way. I know when my mum watched that, and when she saw that, she cried for at least an hour. It was just one word, but it was something that she had been waiting for so long. If this referendum goes through this year and the vote is yes, we get a voice to Parliament, there's going to be tears, you know, because people have waited so long, our people have waited so long for something like this to happen. So they're very significant, you know, events, and we take them very seriously. And which is why I was saying earlier that we need to make sure we get it right this year, because it is a big step, it is a big decision, and we need people to make their decisions based on what they know about it, not what their friend is voting, not what their family is voting, what they know about it and what they're going to vote, what they think is the right vote.
One of the things that I've challenged the church about in the last several weeks or years and decades this morning is you need to be driving this. We Christians in this country have been given a mandate by God to be Christ's ambassadors for reconciliation. What are we doing with that? We're sitting back waiting for the government to do the job that we should have been doing and driving for ever. We ought to be ashamed of ourselves. But we now have a time to raise our voice. There's people like Morel that's been at this agenda as long as, well, before me, you know. Yeah.
Before Anne.
Before Anne, yeah. So, you know, we've been at it a long time and we've been hopeless. I don't know what has gone on, but, you know, and what has been the resistance. But by God, I'm going to hold you accountable, because that same God holds me accountable and I'm going to hold you accountable. You cannot walk this country and call yourself a Christian or a person of faith, because our Creator holds us accountable. And we better stand up and start holding this country accountable, because that's what we're called to do. And I want to hear the voice of our churches, not just from the leaders. I want to hear it from the grassroots. I want to hear it from the congregations. I want to hear the roar of a yes, because we want to change the narrative. We want to transform this country. I tell you, I'm so tired of sitting here and telling you about the suffering of my people over and over and over again, and how broken our relationship is. If we can come to a yes vote, then I know we're on a path to something that is major. As I said, our Damascus moment. Then I know God's work and God's hand is in this journey. And we are going to be the drivers, not the government, but we. Because the relationship begins right here between ourselves. And that's what's the most important aspect of any vote that we have in front of us, is relationship.
Good note to finish on.
I just had my hands full, so I couldn't. We could just keep on going, and that would be wonderful, but I'm very much aware that these two interstate visitors have either woken very early or been travelling, and they have to leave tomorrow as well. I can't thank you enough, and the amount of thanks I've had from people in the room but also online, and someone even sent me a special email just before. This has been a really significant day in so many ways. I thank Uncle Alan for welcoming us here and actually participating and being in conversations, and for Garry and for Anne and your teachings and your wonderful insight. Do you know, I have two gifts, and I feel terrible, Alan, because I've left yours at home. So, mea culpa. That's right. Oh, watch the painting. That's right. So, Garry, so these are made by Reverend Dr. Graham Forser, and they're turned wood. Garry, a mortar and pestle out of very old olive wood.
Oh, right.
Yes.
I'm with you.
And Anne, I hope you don't get paid we'll have to pay your excess luggage when you feel the weight of this one. It's a very large eucalyptus bowl. Workers' compensation through gift. So that I was thinking maybe you could have it in your office as a reminder that while you feel the bowl is empty, we are all going to be working with you and listening and learning and teaching and sharing to actually pass on the message. So hopefully your bowl will be overflowing. At the beginning of tonight's session, I started with one of my favourite 2,000-year-old readings. And yet here we have distillation over today of 110,000 years of wisdom and story. Puts it into perspective, doesn't it? Down the front here on the representation of our dry and beautiful rich land, I have a kulamon that has been there for carrying food and babies and tools and water and life-giving things. And in the kulamon is actually seeds from the kwangdong tree, which for Kaurna people is a really significant fruit, a nourishment fruit, but also has a lot of story. But throughout 110,000 years, God's living word of water has flowed through the land as well. So while we come and see it as a dry and desolate place, we know that is not so, that growth happens and flourishes in ways that is beyond our understanding. So tonight as we leave, let us remember that we are part of that living water and flowing out into the wider community, into the people that we meet in everyday life, whether it be at the church that we go to or in our workplace or even at the supermarket. Auntie Anne has had made badges, the Yes badges. I know people have been buying them out the front there. If you want some more, if your church is all going to have one and you need to order 90, then you can just contact Churches Together SA and we'll try and get them to you and have them available for you to collect. But by having this badge is the beginning of a quiet statement so people can say, what are you going to vote yes about? Off you go. So as we leave here today, I'd like to say thank you to our tech team. Thank you that you've enabled people online to join with us in the room. Thank you to Emma, who's been is my colleague, and she has been out there on the computer making sure that people are being responded to with their questions online too. Pardon?
I said God bless.
God bless Emma. God bless us all. So a blessing as we leave. As we leave here, we carry with us teachings on history, community, spirituality, and of the heart. We are innately connected in our humanity and in our spirits. So may we step out together with open hands, reaching towards each other, and kindly hearts, loving each other. May we meet on the pathway together and walk forward this year, so we as a community choose to live as one. Amen. Go in peace and thank you so much. 2 weeks' time, we'll have the day's information available for you all so you can share it amongst your communities or just watch it all over again. Thank you very much indeed.
Tell them we're having a conference too in July. Oh. We'll have it on your website.
Okay, and there's a conference in July that will be up in Queensland, and Indigenous theologians will be gathering from around Australia to continue the conversation, and we'll have it advertised through our Churches Together SA website too. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.